All right, paragraph 6, title policy and survey. Section A is title policy. Seller shall furnish to buyer at either seller's or buyer's expense an owner policy of title insurance issued by blank title company in the amount of the sales price dated at or after closing, insuring the buyer against loss under the provisions of the title policy, subject to the promulgated exclusions, including existing building and zoning ordinances and the following exceptions. And then it runs through a litany of exceptions. So let me first talk about who should be paying for the title policy, seller or buyer. Well, you're not going to back me into that answer because it is negotiable, right? But I will tell you, most of the time we see the seller pay for the owner title policy for the buyer. Then the buyer pays for the lender's title policy, which is not addressed here. It is really just something that between the lender and the buyer, the lender is going to require in order to write the loan for the buyer. And so that is just not addressed here. That is something separate. So normally seller is going to pay for the owner title policy, buyer is going to pay for the mortgagee title policy or lender's title policy. The title policy amount is set by the state. So it's set by the Texas Department of Insurance. So it is the same amount at any title company you go to. And it is, you can easily look up to see what that fee will be. If you just Google Texas title insurance, there should be a calculator out there. You can put in the sales price of your property and it will calculate that for you. This is something that the buyer can choose to pay for. It's going to make their offer that much more, that much better on the net sheet. So it's something that really you can use as a negotiating tactic to really make your buyer's offer stand above the others. If you check both boxes, then it means that you will split the cost of the title policy between the two. So that is also an option at any point in the contract. If you see those double boxes that you select both, then it would be that it's just split between the two. As far as title company name there, fairly self-explanatory. It should be wherever the escrow agent, is that normally is going to be your title insurance there. All right, so let me scroll through all of these exceptions. I'm not going to read through all of them, but I'm going to get down to this number 8. This is one of our newest exceptions to this, and it says the standard printed exception as to discrepancies, conflicts, shortages in area or boundary lines, encroachments or protrusions, or overlapping improvements. And then it does give you a choice here of you either will not be amended or deleted from the title policy, or this other section that says will be amended to read shortages in area at the expense of the either buyer or seller. Again, if you kept both, then that would be split. All right, this is what we call the survey coverage to the owner title policy. And this says that, hey, we're going to take the survey, and if there is a discrepancy on the boundary line, if there is some sort of conflict, something like that, then the title company is going to defend that for you if you amend it, if you chose number 2 and amended to read only shortages in area at the expense of the buyer or seller. If somebody is buying that additional survey coverage, then you're going to get some extra coverage on it, and it lasts for the whole time that buyer owns that property. The cost on it is 5% of the owner title policy as of now. So this is August of 2020. Y'all, I never know when the Texas Department of Insurance is going to change things, but as of right now, that's a 5% bump onto the owner title policy, and it's a lot of coverage. So I love it. I want to get that for all of my buyers, and really, I want to encourage my sellers to go ahead and provide that for all my buyers too, because it's such a small amount of cost, and it could really prevent some lawsuits down the road. And so I see it as a great risk reduction tool. I don't love it when people just check one blindly and say, yeah, we don't need that. To me, for such a low amount of money, it's a great coverage. So again, that's my encouragement to you. But do some more research. Find out more about that coverage specifically to make sure that you're serving your client well in that section. Okay, then let's get down to B. And it says with the commitment, within 20 days after the title company receives a copy of this contract, seller shall furnish to buyer a commitment for title insurance, known as the commitment, and at buyer's expense, legible copies of restrictive covenants and documents evidencing exceptions in the commitment, also known as the exception documents, other than the standard printed exceptions. So this is saying that the seller is going to provide that to the buyer. Well, obviously the seller is really not going to be providing it. It's going to be coming from the title company, but it is on the seller's behalf. And so that's what this is saying. I said, hey, within 20 days, the buyer is going to get that copy of that commitment, and they're going to get any of the extra exception documents. There's really no fee for any of that at this point because it's all delivered electronically. So it should be fine on there. It's just clarifying if there is some sort of fee for printing or something like that, then it would be done at the buyer's expense. All right. And then it just goes into other sections of, hey, the buyer could extend closing or terminate the contract if they did not get the commitment. I will tell you, we rarely see that. The title companies are really on it. They know how important it is to make sure that the buyer gets all of that information. All right. Paragraph C, survey. The survey must be made by a registered professional land surveyor, also known as RPLS, acceptable to the title company and buyer's lender. And then it says check one box only. Section 1 is within blank days after the effective date of this contract, seller shall furnish to buyer and title company seller's existing survey of the property and a residential real property affidavit promulgated by the Texas Department of Insurance, TDI, which is also known as a T47 affidavit. Then in bold, if seller fails to furnish the existing survey or affidavit within the time prescribed, buyer shall obtain a new survey at seller's expense no later than 3 days prior to the closing date. Whoa. And then a section that says if the existing survey or affidavit is not acceptable to the title company or the buyer's lender, buyer shall obtain a new survey at either the seller's or the buyer's expense no later than 3 days prior to the close date. Okay, so we see this often, that this is the paragraph that is selected. Because let's get real, those next two sections are really just saying, hey, within a certain number of days after the effective date, either the buyer's going to get a new survey at their expense or the buyer's going to get a new survey at the seller's expense. So this one is if there is any sort of existing survey, we're going to agree now to use it unless the lender or the title company cannot. So the responsibility for the seller is that they have to provide both the survey and the T47 affidavit. They can't just provide one. If they only provide one, then what happens? Well, it falls into that bolded area that says, hey, if the seller didn't do what they said within that number of days after the effective date, then the seller gets to buy a brand new survey for that buyer. Period. End of story. There's nothing else to talk about. They either did it or they didn't. Now, as an agent, you have responsibility for delivery of that. So you need to keep track of that date. I will tell you, for us, we really want to make sure that we have the seller and we have the survey and the T47 from the seller on our listings before we list the property. I scan all of that in. So I scan the seller's disclosure, the survey, and the T47 all in one section. And so then I require that they sign the seller's disclosure before we accept the offer. And so what does that mean? Well, they had to get the survey and the T47 when they signed that seller's disclosure because it was all scanned in one document. You can't say you got one without the other because they're all in one document. So that's my preferred method. But if you're not doing that, just make sure that you have some sort of paper trail to show that you sent it to the buyer or buyer's agent in this case within that number of days of the contract. Now, if the survey is cut off, if there was an additional building built, if there was anything on that, this does not speak to that. Now, those are reasons that the title company or the lender may not be able to use that survey. And so if that happens, then it's going to fall to that second section, not bolded, where it says if the existing survey or affidavit is not acceptable to the title company or buyer's lender, then the buyer gets a new survey, and then that's where we decide who pays for it. It's automatically the seller's expense if they don't provide it. It could be either one of their expense if it goes to that second section. I will tell you, when I'm writing an offer for a buyer that I really want to be accepted, I'm going to mark this as a buyer's expense every single time because probably it's not going to get that far, right? Probably the title company is going to be able to use it and the lender is going to be able to use it. It's not 100% of the time, but man, I'd say 85% of the time we're probably looking at it's not an additional expense that's needed. But if it is something that if I'm representing the seller and this is checked for seller, then I'm going to include that $400 maybe in on my net sheet and reduce the buyer's offer for that. I hope that makes sense. And I will tell you that cost is what is kind of appropriate in our market for a residential lot and block survey. If you're doing something that is outside of that, maybe it's a rural property or acreage or meets and bounds or something else, then it could be a much more expensive survey to purchase. And so it could be a much more expensive check mark on one of those options. It could also be a much more expensive mistake if you forgot to deliver either the survey or the T47 affidavit in those number of days as shown there in paragraph 6C1. All right. Section D, objections. Buyer may object in writing to defects, exceptions, or encumbrances to title disclosed on the survey other than items 6A1 through 7 above, disclosed in the commitment other than 6A1 through 9 above, or which prohibit the following use or activity. Then it says buyer must object the earlier of the closing date or blank days after buyer receives the commitment, exception documents, and survey. Okay, I'm not going to go over the whole rest of this paragraph because here's the thing. If you get to this part where your buyer or the buyer wants to object, they really have a lot of power in this section. And any attorney or any buyer that goes to an attorney is likely going to say, when did you receive your commitment? When did you receive those exception documents? When did you receive your survey? Because if they just received it or if they have not received it yet, they basically have this option out that they can say, hey, we didn't get it, or hey, we didn't like this electric easement. Well, we can't do anything about the electric easement. Sorry, we're out. Okay. This is a huge section that the buyer has a lot of power to get out of the contract in all of that language below. So we want to make sure that this is filled out as appropriately as possible. For me, that where it says which prohibit the following use or activity, a lot of people are going to fill in single family residential, something like that there. That's okay. This is a 1 to 4 family residential contract. So to me, that's a little trite. Like we already know that that's what this was going to be. So I don't know that that's really necessary to put in. What I'm really going to put in there is if I know about something that they are contemplating using this property for, like maybe a home office, adding a swimming pool, maybe running a daycare out of the house, maybe they want to park their RV on the property, something like that. That's what I'm going to really make sure that I have added in there. If you wanted to have some of those other things in there, that's fine, but that's what I really want to clarify there. Then I am fairly insistent that it has to have a number of days loaded into this paragraph 6D. I will tell you, I see it so many times on contracts that I'm reviewing where no date has been filled in there. Well, I just don't think that's fair to the seller because to me that leaves it open-ended where the buyer has really all the way up until closing to opt out by virtue of one of these things. I like 3 days in there, and so to me, that's a reasonable amount of time. Hey, buyer, you got the commitment, you got the accession documents, you got the survey. You should have been doing some due diligence during this process and reviewing it for whatever you felt like was important to make sure that you're good. Now, are they actually going to do that? I don't know. Maybe not, but I don't think it's appropriate to leave this all the way open-ended all the way until closing. So whatever number of days you and the buyer and the seller, that everybody is comfortable with, make sure that there is some number of days there so that way it's not just open-ended all the way until closing. All right. Paragraph 6E, title notices, and this just goes over an abstract or title policy that, hey, brokers recommend that you have an abstract of title pulled. That's really what the commitment is. And so it's saying, hey, you should have an attorney or you should review the commitment. Then the section 2, membership in property owners association. The property is or is not subject to mandatory membership in a property owners association. And then it goes over and declares that, hey, in bold and underline, you are obligated to pay assessments to the property owners association. It's also known as a homeowners association, right? The amount of the assessments is subject to change. Your failure to pay the assessments could result in enforcement of the association's lien on and the foreclosure of the property. It's a big deal, and so we want to make sure even if the agent forgot to add the mandatory membership in a property owners association addendum to the contract, that we have clarified it here. Now, if that is checked yes, or the property is right here, then they should be attaching that addendum as well. All right, and that's what this section is saying again in bold down here. If buyer is concerned about these matters, which they should be, the TREC promulgated addendum for property subject to mandatory membership in a property owners association should be used. All right. Number 3, statutory tax districts. If the property is situated in a utility or other statutorily created district providing water, sewer, drainage, or flood control facilities and services. Chapter 49, the Texas Water Code requires seller to deliver and buyer to sign statutory notice related to tax rate, bonded indebtedness, or standby fee of the district prior to final execution of the contract. Yep, that's a thing. We don't have a lot of that in the Metroplex, but across the state, that may be a bigger issue in your neck of the woods. Tidewaters saying, hey, there is an addendum for notice promulgated by TREC if there is something that's close to Tidewaters. Annexation, if the property is outside of the limits of a municipality. This is just saying that, hey, they may be annexed at some point down the road. And property located in a certificated service area of utility service provider. Again, this has to be disclosed to the buyer. Public improvement districts, and we do have some of these in the Metroplex, and so it just says if the property is in a public improvement district, seller requires the seller to notify buyer as follows, and then it clarifies that there. Transfer fees, if the property is subject to a private transfer fee, they're required to notice. If it's in a propane gas system service area, so this is not just having a propane tank, but this is a requirement to use a certain propane gas provider, you would have to provide that. And then again, kind of like Tidewaters, notice of water level fluctuations. We added this after we had several years of drought in Texas and the lakes changed. So now we have that too. All right, let's flip over to the new form and just look at any changes that are in this one. And that's, okay. I was thinking that we didn't have any changes in it. So yeah, no changes in the new form on that. So really we should be set on this. There's not a whole lot that you have to do with this paragraph 6, but like I said, really watch out for adding in the survey coverage on that owner title policy, making sure that you've adopted the right seller option, the right survey options on there. And then in that paragraph 6D, make sure that you have a number of days in there. That should be it for paragraph 6.